Back in 2004, scientists at a Bay Area genetics lab were trying to do something nearly impossible. They wanted to extract mitochondrial DNA from bone fragments that had been dead for over a century and a half. They were hunting for a smoking gun, some kind of physical genetic proof of cannibalism within the Donner Party. But the evidence had been put through a process of absolute destruction. These bones had been cooked, boiled for grease, and charred in a hearth. Then they sat through 158 winters of freezing wet and baking dry cycles in the acidic soil of the mountains. Because of this, the DNA extraction failed. The genetic material was just too degraded to amplify. The scientists were left with nothing but a handful of gray powder. This failure, though, actually opens up a more complex investigation. We're moving past the shorthand of cannibal monsters to find the forensic truth of what actually happened in those peaks. Cold. Absolute, suffocating cold. The Sierra Nevada mountains are not a place for the living in the winter of 1846. They are a limestone void, a place where the wind screams through the pines. To understand the horror, you have to look at the map. The group didn't just vanish into the snow. They split into two separate, desperate camps. One cluster was located near the eastern end of what is now Donner Lake. This was the larger settlement, housing about 60 people, including families like the Breens, Reeds, Graves, Murphys, and Eddies. They were huddling together, trying to claw a living out of the frozen earth. But they weren't alone in their desperation. A second camp existed 6 miles northeast of the lakeside at Alder Creek. Nestled in the Alder Creek meadow, this group was further isolated, separated from the others by a wall of white. History often treats this tragedy as a single monolithic event. But they were severed. 2 pockets of starving people, 6 miles of impassable snow between them, each fighting a silent mathematical battle against the time it takes for a human body to starve. Consider the scale of this migration. In 1846, the Donner Party was a wagon train headed for California, moving along the Oregon Trail. They weren't just explorers, they were families. Roughly 81 to 87 migrants ascended the mountains in October, pushing their livestock and 60 to 80 wagons through the high mountain passes. When you look at the numbers, the group consisted of men, women, and children. The innocent hope of a new life in the West was the only thing driving them. But the mountains didn't care about family units. By the end of the winter, only 40 to 48 members survived. The rest were left behind in the snow. Out of the 87 people, 48 made it out, and in some accounts, only 3 mules survived the ordeal. It was a brutal, clinical subtraction of human life. It all began with a lie. Lansford Hastings had promoted a shortcut, the Hastings Cutoff, claiming it would shave precious days off the journey. The party trusted him, but the shortcut was a nightmare of impassable terrain and undocumented hazards. They spent weeks hacking through brush and hauling wagons over mountains that should have been avoided. This mistake cost them a month of critical time. By the time they reached the high passes, the window of opportunity had slammed shut. Then came the broken axle. At the Alder Creek site, 22 people, including both Donner families, the leaders of the journey, were trapped. It was a simple mechanical failure. George Donner's wagon axle snapped and the group stalled. They didn't know it, but they had just become stationary targets for the winter. The snow arrived faster than expected, burying them where they stood. George and Jacob Donner, brothers who had dreamed of California, were now just men staring at a white void that erased the road, the horizon, and any hope of escape. They were no longer travelers. They were prisoners of the peaks. There was a towering pine at Alder Creek that once held a kind of sacred morbid status. For decades, the Donner tree was incorrectly identified as the site of the family camp. Tourists flocked to it, believing they were standing on the exact ground where the starvation began. But the physical record didn't match the myth. In the early 1990s, archaeologist Don Hardesty from the University of Nevada, Reno, stepped onto that site and began to dig. He found no evidence of a camp at the base of the Donner tree. Nothing. No hearths, no debris, no signs of human habitation. The truth was hiding in plain sight, just a short distance away. Using metal detectors, Hardesty located the real camp about 200 yards away from the tree. The landmark was a lie. The actual agony had happened in the silence of the scrub, away from the tree that history had chosen to remember. Under the shade of 100-foot-tall ponderosa pines and foot-high wildflowers, the ground finally yielded its secrets. In the summer of 2003, archaeologists Kelly Dixon and Julie Shablitsky began a forensic excavation at the Alder Creek site. They weren't looking for a myth, they were looking for the dirt. Deep in the meadow, about a foot below the surface, they found it, a cooking hearth. This was the center of the family camp. Around it, the debris of a desperate struggle for survival was scattered. They recovered hand-painted ceramic tableware with a sprig pattern, pipe bowl fragments, and lead musk balls. There was a brass chain link from a woman's necklace, possibly belonging to Eltha Donner, and a fragment of a child's writing slate. Then they looked at the bones. The team recovered 16,240 fragments of bone from the site. These weren't just remains, they were atomized. Everything had been boiled. The fragments showed pot polish, a wear pattern caused by boiling bones for extremely long periods to extract every last drop of grease and marrow. A small amount of marrow from a cow femur provides roughly 100 calories, about the same as a single large apple. To extract it, the bones from oxen and horses were subjected to repetitive percussion damage, shattered into small fragments to fit into a pot, and boiled over and over. It was a mathematical efficiency of starvation. There is a cold, clinical horror in that phrase, mathematical efficiency. We usually think of survival as an act of will or a desperate scramble, but here it was a ledger, a calculation of calories versus hours. When you realize that those 16,000 bone fragments represent the last, final effort to stave off the inevitable, the word savagery feels wrong. This wasn't a descent into madness. It was a disciplined, systematic attempt to survive. They weren't acting like monsters. They were acting like accountants of their own demise, counting every single calorie until there was nothing left to count. Looking at the survival rates, the numbers reveal a brutal biological filter. Of the 21 people who spent the winter at the Alder Creek site, only 11 survived. The result is clinical, almost surgical precision of death. It wasn't the cold or the sudden storm that decided who lived, but the physiological capacity to endure starvation. The adults were gone. The 11 survivors were all children or teenagers at the time. The young, with slower metabolic rates and lower absolute caloric requirements, simply outlasted the rest. While the men were consumed by the same hunger that killed the parents, the children clung to life in the same dirt where their families disappeared. December 26, 1846 marks a shift in the record. A smaller group, desperate to escape the mountains, set out on a breakdown of hope, a group called the Forlorn Hope. They were 15 people, including 2 Miwok men named Luis and Salvador. Something shifted in that group. When the snows deepened, William Foster shot and killed Luis and Salvador, the 2 Miwok guides, and the group then ate their bodies. This wasn't survival cannibalism of the dead. It was a distinct case of cannibalism involving murder. They intentionally killed for food. But the written records of the lake camp were different. Patrick Breen's diary entry from February 26, 1847, provided the first mention of cannibalism at the lake camp, though it was ambiguous. The forensic silence at the Alder Creek site stands in contrast to these accounts. We are left with a row of names and dates, and a gap between what was written in a diary and what the soil reveals. Amidst the desperation, there was a hand extended in kindness, and it was met with violence. The Wovu people, a local Native American tribe, had attempted to aid the starving pioneers. They brought food, they offered guidance, they tried to provide the very resources that could have saved dozens of lives. But the pioneers, blinded by a mixture of fear and a perceived racial hierarchy, responded with distrust and, in some cases, gunfire. They rejected the help of the people who actually knew how to survive in the Sierra Nevada. The tragedy was not just the snow or the shortcut. It was the refusal to accept salvation from the only people who could provide it. The mountains didn't kill them all. Their own pride and prejudice did. 2 camps, 2 entirely different stories. At the lake camp, the records are clear. But at the Alder Creek site, the physical evidence is silent. Despite extensive analysis, the research team could not identify a single bone fragment at the creek site as human. Not one. Yet, the written accounts from the rescuers are visceral. In late February 1847, rescuers found Jean-Baptiste Trudeau carrying a human leg at the creek. They found the dismembered body of Jacob Donner and the horrific reality that Elizabeth Donner had been feeding her husband's organs to her children. The soil has erased the human evidence, but the witness accounts leave us with a paradox. A camp where no human bones were found in 2004, but where a father's organs were consumed to keep children alive. The truth of the Donner Party doesn't live in the legend of monsters, but in the dirt. It is found in the pot polish of a shattered ox bone, the brass link of a lost necklace, and the small, graphite-stained fragment of a child's writing slate. These aren't just artifacts, they are the longitude markers of a methodical, agonizing refusal to die. We remember Luis and Salvador, the guides who were murdered not by the mountains, but by the people they were trying to save. We remember the children who outlasted their parents because their bodies required less to survive. The forensic silence at Alder Creek doesn't erase the horror, it only reveals the scale of the desperation. The bones were boiled until they were powder, and the evidence was dissolved by the earth, leaving us with one final, unsettling question. At what point does the will to survive stop being a triumph and start becoming a nightmare?